Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Zimmerman. I am a senior in the Material Science and Engineering department, and today I'll be talking a little bit about my capstone project. So let me just share the screen. So my capstone project has a research focus area, and I'll give just a little bit of background on my capstone. So I got involved with this project when I decided to participate in the Summer Undergraduate Research Experience, or SURE program, through the College of Engineering. So I did this program the summer after my sophomore year, and I decided to work with Professor Rachel Goldman's group because her SURE project seemed really interesting, and she was also in the Material Science and Engineering department. So I thought it would be great to get some more experience in my field of study. So in terms of what I learned and how it will apply to my future career, I'm planning on pursuing my PhD at Stanford University in the fall. And so everything I've learned during this research experience has been incredibly valuable and will be directly applicable to the work that I'll do as a PhD student. And so a few of those things, being self-motivated, problem solving and decision making, organization and documentation, as well as technical communication, and then knowing how to ask for help. All of these things are things I learned throughout the duration of my capstone and my research experience as a whole. And they'll be directly, like I said, directly applicable to my work as a future PhD student. And so this talk is adapted from a talk I gave for a conference a couple weeks ago, and I've tried to simplify it and make it a little bit more accessible to people without a material science background. And so my talk was on the X-ray diffraction studies of gallium nitride PIN structures for high power electronics. And I'd like to thank the co-authors on this paper, or this talk, who are both in the Material Science and Engineering department, as well as the Michigan Ion Beam Lab. And I'd also like to thank our collaborators from Yale University from their electrical engineering department. And so gallium nitride is a very promising material for high power electronic applications due to its low on resistance and high breakdown voltage. Both of these properties are very relevant and important when it comes to these high power applications. And these applications also sort of demand this vertical PIN structure that's shown here in the middle. And this, what we're interested in is this PN junction, this interface in between the light blue and gray regions. And in order to make these structures, selective area doping and regrowth is needed. And so again, the main driving question for this research project is, how does regrowth at that PN junction influence the device's structure and properties? And so for my capstone, I actually investigated many more samples than just this 4, but for the sake of this talk, I'm just going to discuss these 4 samples, which gave us some really interesting results. And so again, we're really interested in what's happening at this PN junction. And so first we have a gallium nitride substrate. This is just N-type GaN. This will be used as a control and a comparison for the other samples. Then we have the in situ regrowth, where all 3 layers were grown without interruption. And then we have these two, the last 2 samples here are more interesting. The N-type region, the N-type layers, the first 2 layers are grown without interruption. And then both of these samples were removed from the growth chamber. And this ex situ sample was left out, just exposed to air for 24 hours, and then put back in the growth chamber to grow the P-type layer. And similarly, the ICP regrowth was removed after the NGAN layers were grown, but instead of just ex situ exposure, our collaborators at Yale used inductively coupled plasma to etch the sample surface, and then it was returned to the growth chamber to grow the P-type layer. And so here I'm just reiterating the central research question. And the more specific question that I'm interested in, and the work, most of the work that I did for my capstone, was trying to answer, or trying to figure out, how can we quantify device crystallinity? And so the answer to this is by using high resolution X-ray diffraction, or HRXRD. And so X-ray diffraction is governed by Bragg's law, which is given here. So this mathematical relationship allows us to determine at what angle we need to configure the incident X-ray beam with respect to our sample surface in order to get constructive interference, which shows up as this peak collected by the detector. And so depending on which planes you want to probe, and those unique planes having a specific interplanar spacing, that will determine that angle at which you need to configure your incident beam. And so for my work, I have two experimental configurations that I used for this capstone. The first of which being a symmetric configuration, where just like the diagram at the top, the angle between the sample surface and the incident beam, omega, is the same as the Bragg angle. So the Bragg condition here is satisfied and you're able to probe planes parallel to the sample surface. An asymmetric experiment is required if you want to probe planes at an angle to the sample surface. And so here the Bragg condition is still being satisfied. So you get that constructive interference and you can see those peaks. But instead you have to tilt the entire configuration because the planes that you're trying to probe are at an angle to the sample surface. And so these two experiments come into play as I'm trying to calculate the threading dislocation density of these samples. And so threading dislocations are two-dimensional defects that, two-dimensional line defects that propagate up through the sample, through all of the layers perpendicular to the sample surface. And so the two types of threading dislocations or TDs that I'm investigating with this work are screw type and edge type. So screw type dislocations are known to distort planes parallel to the sample surface. And so then that requires that first experimental geometry that I showed on the previous slide, the symmetric configuration, to probe those planes. And the edge type threading dislocations, on the other hand, distort planes at an angle to the surface. So in order to quantify those, I need that second asymmetric experimental configuration. And so this is the basis for how we can quantify screw and edge type dislocation densities using X-ray diffraction. And so first I'll show the results for the screw type threading dislocations. And so here we have those peaks, an example of which I showed you when I talked a little bit about Bragg's law. And for the first part of the analysis I do is quantifying the peak widths. So that's called the full width at half the maximum. So that's the width of the peak at half the max intensity. And I use that peak width to then calculate the screw type threading dislocation density. And so in this case, we see that the X situ has the largest screw type TD density, followed by the ICP etch. So both of these were the ones with interface preparation methods that were exposed to air. And we see that they have the largest screw type threading dislocation density, meaning they have the worst crystal quality in terms of screw type TDs. On the other hand, here are the results for the edge type threading dislocation densities. So you can see the peaks here look very different than the previous ones. The main takeaway here is that through a similar analysis of quantifying peak width, I can then get a figure or a number for the edge type threading dislocation density, which in this case is the highest for the in situ sample. So again, this in situ sample is the one that was grown without interruption, and it has the worst crystal quality in terms of edge type threading dislocation density. And so now the interesting part is to connect this structural analysis that I did with XRD to the electronic properties that were investigated using cathodoluminescence, which probes the luminescence of the sample at both the at regions near the surface, which is this top plot, as well as regions near that regrowth interface of interest, which is the bottom plot. And so these two plots are virtually identical, except for one key difference, which is that the ICP etch sample actually, the donor acceptor pair emission peak increases from the surface to the interface. And so you see this recovery of some of the electronic properties of this sample. And so at this interface, we also see that once it recovers some of its electronic properties, it trends exactly the same as the trend we see in the screw type threading dislocation densities. So the X situ had the highest screw type TD density, meaning the worst crystallinity. The crystallinity was better for the ICP etched, and then the best for the in situ. And that's the same trend that we see here with the donor acceptor pair emissions at the interface. The X situ had the worst. We see improvement with the ICP etched, and then the in situ had the best. And so the correlation between these two trends leads us to believe that the screw dislocations decrease the donor acceptor pair and near band edge emissions. So essentially the screw dislocations decrease or worsen the electronic properties near the interface. And also some work that was done that was outside the scope of this talk is we detected excess silicon, magnesium, and hydrogen at that same PN junction, at that same interface. And we believe that those actually increase donor acceptor pair and near band edge emissions. So this is just a very quick overview of my capstone. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.